Thank you very much, Susan. We've decided for this session that we'll take questions at the end of everybody's session. So if you have thoughts in your head, just hold on to that thought. I'm now going to go on to introduce Lucy Watts. Lucy's a 24-year-old young person who has a progressive, life-threatening condition. She's benefited from palliative care for over 7 years. She's a passionate advocate. I've worked with Lucy for quite a number of years and she's amazing. A passionate advocate and patient lead, working both within the UK and globally. She works on various topics including palliative care for people of all ages, personalised care, patient involvement, disability and sexuality. She holds numerous roles within organisations. She co-leads research, undertakes paid consultancy and speaking, as well as setting up the International Palliative Care Patient and Carer Network, Palliative Voices. She's currently setting up a charity for young adults with complex health needs, and it's about young adults advocating for themselves and promoting their own wishes and needs. Lucy received her MBE in 2016 for services to young people with disabilities. Lucy.
So thank you, everyone. Obviously, I'm Lucy. Now Alison has introduced me. I have a life-limiting illness that's caused complex medical needs and disability. And I found out 2 weeks ago that it's actually a rare form of mitochondrial disease after years of undiagnosis, misdiagnosis. So it's quite an achievement to get to that point. But it means I have multiple organ failure. I'm dependent on TPN, which is intravenous nutrition. I have various medications, interventions, bags and tubes to function for the organs that can't do it for themselves. And it means I require round-the-clock care, most of this provided by an intensive care nurse, and also my mum is trained in all the techniques necessary to keep me alive. And I also have my assistant's dog Molly, who's a big part of my life, and helps me greatly through her tasks and her medical alert. I've benefited from palliative care since I was 17, and at a point where my medical team had finally had that difficult conversation and explained to us that my condition was going to shorten my lifespan, a conversation which I think they'd been skirting around having for quite a long time. I became supported by the J's Hospice, which is a young adult hospice at home service locally to me. And their support has been invaluable, and it's actually saved my life as well as improved it and changed it. I'm also supported by a palliative care consultant who works locally across the local hospital as well as the local adult hospice, and her support has been fantastic as well. A year after finding out my condition was life-limiting, at the age of 18, I was told my prognosis was less than 5 years, and I'm now 25. I shouldn't have made 23, and I've got a lot of living yet to do. Palliative and hospice care has transformed my life. They've managed my symptoms, they've given me the best quality of life possible, and they're also the reason I'm sitting before you today. It was my palliative care nurse, when doing my end-of-life plan, who said to me, "So what do you want to do now? What matters to you?" And no one had ever asked that question before, and I responded, "I want to make a difference." My hospice nurse didn't forget this, and after doing some filming with the hospice, my nurse Bev put me forward for an opportunity with Together for Short Lives to speak at their reception in the House of Commons, and I haven't looked back since. I have an incredible life thanks to hospice and palliative care, and as Alison said, I've now got an MBE, an honorary master's, and I was recently named as one of the 100 most influential disabled people in Britain. Quite an achievement. But I also believe strongly that palliative care is the reason I've exceeded my prognosis through the life they've given me as a result. And I very much feel they've kept me going mentally and given me a life that enables me to live well, and I think that keeps me going a lot. I was born with health problems, but did not become seriously ill until I was 14. And soon after that, I was housebound and then bedbound, and I was isolated from my peers. I did my education at home with help from home tutors, and I was regularly in hospital in London and prevented from enjoying the newfound freedoms, independence and life experiences of my peers as they were gaining more independence and living life to the full. One aspect of that life that I was isolated from was sex, sexuality and relationships. Unlike the frank conversations that my mother had with my older sister, we'd never had such conversations, but that was because our priority was keeping me alive. Everything else seemed to pale into insignificance, and it was so off the radar. It wasn't even I didn't even consider myself a sexual being or in need of that, because it was just, I need to stay alive, I need to stay alive, and it just became so far removed from me, and that was quite hard. And it wasn't actually until I met a researcher who was researching sex, sexuality and relationships for young people with life-limiting conditions that this aspect of my life was brought to the fore, And I actually started to see myself in that way and to consider myself and what my own wishes and thoughts are. And what I find hard is that why was it a researcher who was the first person in my life who had ever asked me or viewed me as a sexual being or acknowledged that part of my life, let alone help me to explore it? Why had it never come up with any other professional? I had seen hundreds of professionals, nurses, doctors, therapists. No one had ever asked me, recognised it, said anything. And it just, as I said, I didn't even acknowledge it within myself. And this had a knock-on effect in that I saw myself as asexual, unable of having a relationship, being unattractive, but also unworthy. And when you have a disability, feelings of worth come into it a lot. And when you think about yourself as unworthy, that's really damaging. And some people see disabled people as asexual, and as such, that any form of sex and relationships or conversations about this is unnecessary. Some of us as incapable of meaningful relationships, let alone sex intimacy, and goodness forbid, wanting a family. Some especially have prejudiced attitudes towards young people or who are LGBTQ, and I have one of my friends who was asked why she was making her life more difficult to choose to be LGBTQ as well as disabled, as if that was a choice. Sexuality is not a choice, nor is disability. And why is sexuality and disability such an issue? Why are life-limited young adults facing barriers in exploring what is a normal part of life? You know, sex is normal, sexuality is normal, relationships are normal. Why aren't we looking into it? Thank you. It's vital that we realise young people like me with life-limiting conditions do not grow up asexual or indifferent, that we too have wants, needs and desires like any other young person. If you think our peers want it and need it and do it, that's what we should be doing. We must not be infantilised, which happens a lot in the care sector. We must be treated as emerging and maturing adults. And whilst we must ensure we keep young adults safe, and I do not doubt that, we must do so without preventing our right to explore that aspect of our lives. For us, sexuality is a normal part of growing up. Having a disability or life-limiting condition doesn't change that. We just face additional hurdles and barriers in exploring that part of our lives and need support to do so. Professionals, and indeed our parents and carers, must set aside their own perspectives and have these so-called difficult conversations with their young people and help them with their right to explore their sexuality. We must stop sex, sexuality and relationships for people with disabilities and life-limiting illnesses being a taboo. We as a society are sending the wrong messages to young people like me, and that has a damaging effect on our lives and on our emotional well-being. Another aspect that is difficult for young adults is the inability to experiment, to take acceptable risks, to have casual relationships, to explore their emerging sexuality, to be able to make their own decisions and be supported in those choices, even if those around them might not agree with them. And while safeguarding is important, and we should do that, and we must make sure young people are kept safe, we can't limit a young person's right to explore this part of their life, to explore their sexuality, to make their own decisions, and even make mistakes, because that's how we learn. We learn by making mistakes, and we learn by experimenting. All young people get to experiment through their teenage years. They do things that they probably shouldn't. They make their parents cringe. That's part of growing up, and that's part of how we learn who we are. We also often lack the social opportunities that our peers enjoy, which is a really big problem. This can be due to inaccessible venues, a lack of care hours, or restrictions of our actual care packages themselves. For some of us, our care providers, parents, carers and professionals may prevent us from attending certain social situations or be unhappy to support us in that social situation. We face so many barriers and restrictions in our lives. And if you can't meet other people, how can you form relationships? How can we ever explore our sexuality in intimate lives? Not only for that, but for people like me who need 24/7 care, it's quite off-putting trying to chat someone up when you've got a nurse, a carer, or your parents sitting in the room next to you, managing all your needs. It's not nice. But it's really hard because that's our life. We have to have those carers with us. We can't have a choice in that. One important thing about sexuality is that we must accept that sexuality is not just about actual intercourse, which people seem to confuse it with. Whilst that's part of it, there's actually so much more to sexuality and relationships than just sex. It's about being loved, being seen as attractive. It's about positive body image. It's about exploring and forming your gender and sexual identity. It's about finding your place in the world, being comfortable with who you are. It's about friendships as much as relationships. It's about being intimate, from hand-holding, kissing and cuddling, yes, to sex itself. It's about emotional well-being and about feeling a part of the world around you. So often we are isolated from the world, and when you don't feel connected with the world, that can be really difficult. We may need support with some or all of our lives, and this can make it hard, not just in terms of sex itself, but in exploring relationships generally and our lives as a whole. Young people still may want to become parents, and around there this is also a lot of work, overcoming a lot of prejudiced attitudes towards these young people becoming parents, such as supporting them with the process from genetic counselling to family planning, from pregnancy to stopping medications and making plans for that, and the support to actually be a parent with your life-limiting condition. So a friend of mine is trying for a baby and has a life-limiting condition and has suffered multiple miscarriages in her stillbirth. And she's been told that maybe this is the world's way of telling her she shouldn't be having children and she should give up on that dream. But why shouldn't she be supported to be a mum? That's all she wants to do in life. That is her great big goal for life. And yet she's been prevented by attitudes rather than actual support. She's got the medical support, but yet the attitudes of those around her are what she's fighting. As I mentioned briefly, we must also appreciate that exploring sex, sexuality and relationships is actually integral to emotional well-being. It's a part of life, it's a part of growing up, it's a part of our experience of ourselves and the world around us, and it's a universal want, need and desire. The link between the two, between sexuality and emotional well-being, is really underestimated. I don't think people recognise it in the same way as it should be. And we must make sure that young people like me are able to explore sexuality and relationships as a normal part of our lives and growing up. And those around us know how to support us in that aspect of our lives. We must stop infantilising disabled people and preventing them from exploring sex, sexuality and relationships, and all the things linked to this. We must stamp out prejudices, ensure that unnecessary barriers are not created, and ensure our rights are upheld. We must also recognise that individuals with learning disabilities have sexual needs and desires. A learning disability doesn't remove that, doesn't remove those innate needs, desires and feelings and the maturing body in a sexual context. And although I don't have time to develop on this today, we must recognise that everyone is a sexual being, even if they need support to achieve that. In order to achieve this, services, hospices and teams should have a sexuality policy to know where staff stand in terms of supporting young people with their needs and sexuality in their relationships. And this may include appointing sexuality champions, which was something that Alison developed at Rainbow's Hospice. And having the champions within the organisation means that all staff and patients have someone to go to who can help with this aspect of their life and know where they stand. And before I end my speech, I wanted to share through my work with the Open University Sexuality Alliance, of which Alison's a part. In 2016, we produced the Sexuality Guidance and Standards, which supports professionals and organisations to know how to support young people with life-limiting conditions to explore sex, sexuality and relationships, but also where they stand within the law, and as case studies and stories that can help you understand this. And if you would like a copy, come and find me, and I can either give you a copy or you can grab my email and I'll email you a copy. But also the Open University Sexuality Alliance generally works to improve the lives of young people with life-limiting conditions to explore sexuality, sex and relationships by supporting professionals, parents, carers, and also young people ourselves. So the Alliance was formed in 2014, and our first project was producing the guidance. We've now moved on to our second phase of work, which is being done in conjunction with Hospice UK. So we've just been awarded £40,000 by Together for Short Lives to develop some open educational resources. So these are mixed media resources that are they're not actually giving information, but they're more about starting those conversations. So professionals starting it with young people starting it with professionals, with parents, with carers, giving them the tools to be able to have those conversations and feel okay with having them. And we're really looking forward to getting started on that project. So I hope my speech has opened your eyes and helped you think about things in a different way, and that maybe you can take some things away in your clinical practice and be more understanding, but also more empowered to understand this issue and to support your patients with it, because this applies to everyone, not just young people, all adults with life-limiting conditions, and all adults generally. Everyone in this room has got a gender and sexual identity. That's part of who you are, and we are no different. Hospice palliative care services need to recognise and include sex, sexuality and relationships in part of the care given to all patients and their families. And young people who have life-limiting conditions are still young people. We must make sure we have access to the same life experiences, choices, opportunities, the ability to explore this aspect of our lives, to have relationships of all kinds, and also the fulfilment of our basic human rights. Sex, sexuality and relationships are a normal part of life. We must ensure young people have their rights upheld and can access, explore and fulfil this part of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy.